What if I told you that billions of taxpayer dollars, money meant to feed the hungry and help vulnerable kids, may have quietly disappeared right under everyone's nose? Not millions, not a few bad checks, billions. Here's the scary part. This didn't happen in the shadows. It happened in plain sight through programs designed to do good. Programs you and I were told were protected, audited, and safe. So, how does something this big slip through? How does fraud grow so large that prosecutors stop calling it corruption and start calling it industrial scale? I've spent decades watching how money, power, and systems really work. And one thing I've learned the hard way is this: the biggest failures don't come from villains hiding in basements, they come from broken oversight, misplaced trust, and leaders who look the other way just long enough. Tonight, we're going to break this story down calmly, clearly, and honestly. No political noise, no panic, just facts, patterns, and questions that demand answers. And by the end of this video, you may never look at government programs or accountability the same way again. At its core, this story is about how a system designed to help vulnerable people was allegedly turned into a massive money making operation. According to federal prosecutors, multiple individuals were charged in connection with large scale fraud schemes tied to housing, medical, and social assistance programs in Minnesota. These weren't small clerical errors or isolated cases of abuse. Authorities say the claims were inflated, fabricated, or outright false, adding up to millions of dollars taken from taxpayer funded programs. What makes this especially alarming is how long the activity is believed to have gone on and how many different actors were allegedly involved. The government argues that these schemes exploited programs meant to serve people in real need, families relying on food assistance, children requiring special education services, and communities dependent on public health care support instead of resources reaching those intended recipients. Prosecutors claim the money was diverted through coordinated networks that knew exactly how to work around weak oversight. In some cases, funds were allegedly distributed to individuals who didn't qualify at all, while paperwork was carefully crafted to make everything appear legitimate on the surface. Federal officials have emphasized that this wasn't random or accidental. The alleged fraud followed patterns, repeated claims, familiar names, and financial trails that raised serious red flags. Once investigators began digging deeper, what initially looked like routine administrative spending started to reveal inconsistencies, amounts that didn't match services, programs that didn't align with actual needs, and organizations that existed largely on paper. In simple terms, this wasn't just someone gaming the system. Prosecutors say it was a coordinated effort to drain public funds at scale, hiding behind the complexity of social programs. That's why this case has drawn national attention and why understanding what actually happened is the first step to grasping how serious the allegations really are, what sets this case apart, and why prosecutors are using language like industrial. Scale fraud is not just the dollar amount, but the level of organization behind it. In most fraud cases, investigators deal with one person, one company, or a limited scheme operating in isolation. Here, authorities describe something far more systematic: repeated actions carried out over time, involving multiple individuals, multiple programs, and a structure that allowed the alleged abuse to grow instead of collapse under its own weight. And that kind of scale doesn't happen accidentally. It requires planning, coordination, and a clear understanding of how government systems function. Investigators point out that the alleged schemes were designed to look routine. Claims blended in with legitimate ones, paperwork appeared compliant, and services were reported in ways that didn't immediately trigger alarms. That's exactly how large fraud operations survive, by staying just normal enough to avoid scrutiny while steadily extracting enormous sums of money. Over time, those small amounts compound into millions and eventually billions without any single transaction looking dramatic on its own. Another reason this case stands out is how deeply embedded the alleged fraud appears to be. Prosecutors suggest this wasn't a matter of one loophole being exploited once or twice. Instead, it followed a repeatable formula applied across different programs and organizations. That repetition is a hallmark of industrial scale operations. Once a method works, it gets reused, refined, and expanded. In simple terms, this wasn't just someone gaming the system. Prosecutors say it was a coordinated effort to drain public funds at scale, hiding behind the complexity of social programs. That's why this case has drawn national attention and why understanding what actually happened is the first step to grasping how serious the allegations really are, what sets this case apart, and why prosecutors are using language like industrial. Scale fraud is not just the dollar amount, but the level of organization behind it. In most fraud cases, investigators deal with one person, one company, or a limited scheme operating in isolation. Here, authorities describe something far more systematic, repeated actions carried out over time, involving multiple individuals, multiple programs, and a structure that allowed the alleged abuse to grow instead of collapse under its own weight. And that kind of scale doesn't happen accidentally. It requires planning, coordination, and a clear understanding of how government systems function. Investigators point out that the alleged schemes were designed to look routine. Claims blended in with legitimate ones, paperwork appeared compliant, and services were reported in ways that didn't immediately trigger alarms. That's exactly how large fraud operations survive, by staying just normal enough to avoid scrutiny while steadily extracting enormous sums of money. Over time, those small amounts compound into millions and eventually billions without any single transaction looking dramatic on its own. Another reason this case stands out is how deeply embedded the alleged fraud appears to be. Prosecutors suggest this wasn't a matter of one loophole being exploited once or twice. Instead, it followed a repeatable formula applied across different programs and organizations. That repetition is a hallmark of industrial scale operations. Once a method works, it gets reused, refined, and expanded. Calling it industrial scale also signals intent. Authorities are emphasizing that this wasn't careless misuse or misunderstanding of complex rules. The allegation is that the system itself was treated like a production line, input false claims, output guaranteed payments. That framing matters because it elevates the case from misconduct to something closer to organized financial exploitation. And that's why officials say the magnitude of this fraud cannot be overstated. To understand why this case has drawn so much attention, you have to look closely at the types of programs that were allegedly exploited. These weren't obscure or rarely used funds. They were some of the most sensitive and high impact public assistance programs in the system. According to prosecutors, the schemes centered on services meant to support people facing real hardship, food assistance initiatives, housing support, and specialized medical or educational programs designed for children with unique needs. These programs are built on trust, assuming that providers accurately report services and that claims reflect genuine care being delivered on the ground. That trust is exactly what made them vulnerable. Many of these programs rely on self reporting, reimbursements, and documentation that can be difficult to verify in real time when services are ongoing, daily meals, instructional hours, or healthcare visits. Oversight often happens after the money has already been paid. Investigators allege that this lag created an opportunity for bad actors to submit inflated or entirely fabricated claims while appearing compliant on paper. Everything looked legitimate until someone started asking deeper questions. What's especially concerning, prosecutors suggest, is that financial records may point to money leaving the local system entirely. So that possibility dramatically raises the stakes because it shifts the focus from misuse to potential laundering or international transfers. Even the question of whether investigators had full access to bank records early on has become part of the controversy, highlighting how critical financial transparency is in cases like this. At this stage, not every dollar trail is public and not every allegation has been proven. But history shows that money rarely lies. Financial patterns reveal intent, coordination, and scale in ways testimony alone cannot. That's why following the money isn't just one part of the investigation. It's as the backbone of understanding how this alleged operation functioned and how far its impact may ultimately reach. Large-scale fraud rarely appears out of nowhere, and investigators argue that this case was no exception. What makes situations like this so frustrating is that warning signs often exist long before charges are filed. They're just scattered, subtle, and easy to dismiss in isolation. In Minnesota's case, prosecutors suggest that there were indicators that should have prompted deeper scrutiny much earlier. Unusually high billing amounts, repeated claims from the same providers, and rapid growth and program payouts are all classic red flags in fraud investigations on their own. Each can be explained away. Together, they tell a different story. One major issue is how oversight systems are structured. Many public assistance programs prioritize speed, getting help to people quickly, over intensive verification. That creates gaps where questionable activity can blend in with legitimate operations. When organizations submit consistent paperwork and avoid obvious errors, they often pass routine checks without triggering alarms. Investigators now suggest that this predictability may have been exploited, allowing alleged misconduct to continue while appearing compliant on the surface. Another missed signal may have been the lack of aggressive follow up audits when they happen, are often limited in scope and time. If auditors don't expand their review after spotting inconsistencies, patterns never fully emerge. In cases like this, failure to subpoena financial records early, cross check related entities can delay discoveries by years. By the time deeper questions are asked, the damage is already extensive. There's also the uncomfortable possibility that some warnings were minimized rather than overlooked. Bureaucratic inertia, fear of disrupting essential services, or assumptions that problems were isolated can all slow action. Investigators argue that when systems reward compliance on paper instead of outcomes in reality, they create blind spots. This case highlights how fraud doesn't always hide. It sometimes just waits for someone to connect the dots. As details of the case have emerged, the focus has expanded beyond the alleged fraud itself and onto the question of accountability when public funds are involved, especially at this scale. People naturally want to know who is responsible for oversight and whether warning signs were properly addressed. That's why this case has triggered political fallout, even before all investigations are complete. Lawmakers and watchdogs are asking not just how the alleged schemes operated, but how they were able to continue for so long under existing leadership and regulatory structures. Accountability in situations like this is rarely simple. Public agencies oversee massive budgets and rely on layered systems of checks and balances, many of which involve trust between state officials, administrators, and service providers. When that trust is broken, responsibility can become diffuse. Was it a failure of enforcement, a lack of resources, or policies that unintentionally made abuse easier? These are the questions driving political scrutiny, not necessarily accusations of direct involvement, but concerns about governance and oversight, effectiveness. The controversy has also highlighted how responses matter once allegations surface. Critics argue that slow or limited cooperation with investigators can fuel suspicion, even if no wrongdoing is proven. In high profile cases, transparency becomes almost as important as outcomes. Clear communication, document access, and proactive engagement can reassure the public that leaders take the issue seriously. Without that, doubts tend to grow. Ultimately, this stage of the story isn't about verdicts, it's about trust. Voters expect public officials to safeguard taxpayer money and act decisively when systems are abused. Whether reforms follow, leadership changes occur, or oversight rules tighten will depend on what investigators uncover next. But one thing is clear: once fraud reaches this level, accountability becomes a political issue, whether leaders want it to be or not. While the allegations may be centered in one state, the implications stretch far beyond Minnesota's borders. That's because the programs involved and the vulnerabilities exposed exist nationwide. Federal and state assistance systems across the country operate on similar frameworks: large budgets, decentralized administration, and an emphasis on speed and access. When a case reveals how those systems can allegedly be exploited at scale, it forces a much broader conversation about how secure public spending really is everywhere else. For taxpayers in other states, this story raises an uncomfortable question: could the same thing be happening closer to home? Large fraud cases often serve as case studies, showing investigators, auditors, and bad actors alike what works and what doesn't. If oversight gaps are systemic rather than local, then the risk isn't isolated. That's why federal authorities tend to look closely at high profile cases like this to identify patterns that may be repeated elsewhere under different names and organizations. There's also the issue of public trust. Social programs depend heavily on public support, both politically and financially. When people hear about massive alleged abuse, confidence erodes, not just in one state's administration, but in the idea that these programs can be managed responsibly at all. That erosion has real consequences. It can lead to stricter rules, slower approvals, and reduced funding, which ultimately affects the people these programs were meant to help in the first place. On a national level, this case feeds into debates about oversight, transparency, and reform. Policymakers often respond to major fraud revelations with sweeping changes, sometimes driven more by public pressure than careful analysis. That's why this story matters beyond its headlines. It's not just about what went wrong in Minnesota, it's about what this case reveals, warns, and challenges every other state to confront before history repeats itself. Behind every large scale fraud case, there rests usually a structure that looks less chaotic than people expect. Instead of impulsive decisions or sloppy mistakes, these operations tend to rely on repeatable systems. Investigators often find that once a method successfully extracts money without triggering alarms, it becomes a template. The same paperwork formats are reused, the same billing patterns reappear, and the same small group of people controls multiple entities that look independent on the surface. This creates the illusion of diversity while everything is actually being driven by a centralized strategy. One common tactic is layering. Rather than submitting a single massive claim that would draw attention, alleged fraudsters break activity into smaller, frequent transactions that resemble normal program use. Individually, each claim looks unremarkable. Collectively, they add up to staggering totals. Another hallmark is role separation. Different people handle documentation, finances, and outward facing compliance, making it harder for any one participant to see the full picture or be held fully accountable. Paper compliance plays a huge role as well. Many large fraud schemes don't even ignore rules, they study them. Forms are filled out correctly, deadlines are met, and terminology mirrors official guidelines. On paper, everything looks legitimate. The disconnect appears only when investigators compare reported services to real world outcomes. And that's why on the ground verification is often the turning point in cases like this. Finally, scale itself becomes a defense mechanism. And when fraud grows large enough, it overwhelms oversight systems. Auditors face volume, regulators juggle priorities, and red flags compete with thousands of legitimate claims. This is how fraud can persist for years without collapsing. Understanding these behind the scenes mechanics matters because it shows that stopping large scale fraud isn't just about catching bad actors, it's about disrupting the systems that allow repetition, anonymity, and scale to thrive unchecked. Once a case reaches this stage, the process tends to accelerate rather than slow down. Federal investigators typically shift from establishing probable cause to expanding the scope of the inquiry. That means subpoenas for financial records, communications, and internal documents become more aggressive and far reaching. Banks, service providers, and affiliated organizations may all be compelled to turn over records, even if they aren't directly accused of wrongdoing. This phase is about mapping the full network: who knew what, who benefited, and how decisions were made over time. At the same time, investigators often begin separating individual responsibility from organizational behavior. Some people may face charges for direct participation, while others could be scrutinized for negligence, facilitation, or failure to act when warning signs appear. That distinction matters because it determines whether the case stays limited or grows into something much broader. In complex fraud investigations, new charges often emerge months or even years after the initial arrests as evidence is analyzed and connections are confirmed. There are also serious risks for anyone tied to the alleged schemes, even indirectly. Civil penalties, asset seizures, and funding suspensions can occur alongside criminal proceedings. Organizations may lose eligibility for future public funding long before a trial concludes. For legitimate workers and beneficiaries connected to those organizations, the consequences can be immediate and disruptive. From a public perspective, this space is also where expectations need to be managed. Investigations of this size are slow by design. Financial data takes time to untangle, and prosecutors move carefully to avoid mistakes that could weaken the case. But make no mistake, once subpoenas start stacking up, the direction is usually one way. What happens next isn't just about punishment, it's about defining how far accountability extends and whether the system itself will be forced to change as a result. When stories like this reach the public, it's easy to get lost in the numbers, the charges, and the political back and forth. But the real takeaway goes deeper than any single case or headline. At its core, this story is a reminder of how fragile trust can be when public systems are stretched, complex, and built on good faith. Social programs exist because society agrees that some needs are urgent enough to be shared responsibilities. When those systems are allegedly exploited, the damage isn't just financial, it's moral and structural. The bigger lesson here is that scale changes everything. Small weaknesses in oversight may seem manageable, even acceptable when programs are functioning smoothly. But when those weaknesses are multiplied across time, money, and people, they can turn into massive vulnerabilities. This case shows how important it is to continuously question whether safeguards are keeping pace with growth. Systems that worked yesterday may not be strong enough today. It also highlights why accountability isn't about blame alone. True accountability means learning from failure and making meaningful adjustments before history repeats itself. That includes better transparency, smarter audits, stronger data sharing, and a willingness to act early, even when doing so is uncomfortable or politically inconvenient. Ignoring early warning signs doesn't preserve stability, it only delays disruption. For viewers, the final lesson is awareness. These stories matter because they shape how public money is managed, how programs are trusted, and how future policies are written. Whether reforms follow or not, scrutiny is essential because when fraud reaches this scale, the cost isn't just what was allegedly taken, it's what everyone stands to lose if the system doesn't change. Before we wrap up, I want to hear your take. What part of this story surprised you the most? And what do you think needs to change? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let's actually talk about it. If you want more deep dives like this, make sure to check out our previous video. It connects perfectly with what we covered today. And if you value the time, research, and effort we put into breaking these stories down, please support us by subscribing. It's literally one click, but it helps us more than,